In this video, I'm going to talk about the brief history of Nicholas II. Nicholas II was a Tsar who ruled from 1894 until all the way until 1917. But in this video, I'm going to just look at the early years, and I'm going to look at the early years from 1894 until really just after the 1905 revolution. As I just explained, Nicholas is the third Tsar in our course really to rule, and he really rules just after Alexander III, his father, and when Alexander III dies in 1894, Nicholas takes over, and his reign is tumultuous. Loads happen, and he pretty much does a dreadful thing with it, and it's that I want to start with today. So I'm going to do 3 videos about Nicholas II, the first up to 1906, the second up to the end of the the end of 1916, and then I'm going to do the third just on 1917 alone. So Nicholas takes the throne in 1894. This is a painting of his coronation. You can see the pomp and the splendour here. And the first 10 years of his reign, up until 1904, are known as his personal rule. And they're known as his personal rule because Nicholas pretty much follows in exactly the same vein as his father, Alexander III. And he rules with an iron fist, really, and a total grip on Russia. But even in these years, some pretty odd decisions are made. Firstly, the Great Famine, which had happened in 1891-2, leads to a huge rise in resistance and strikes. Understandably, the Russian people are angry at what has just happened. Nicholas completely ignores them. Secondly, even at his coronation, it goes badly. At the coronation, the celebration crowds were crushed, and in the end, over 1,000 people are killed in that crush because it's so badly managed. And lastly, and I think quite importantly, in 1904, Nicholas ignores the calls for a National Assembly or an All-Zemstvo, and actually just says, no, you're fine with what you've got, but let's carry on in the same vein. Now, understandably, these things here, and a continuation of the policy of Russification, and all of those things that his father had set up, people are angry. And that anger bubbles over, really, in 1905. And this is when a revolution happens. And a revolution begins in January of that year. And in this engraving you can see here, you can see the Russian people, led by Father Gapon, leading their protest about how angry and upset they are. But let's start firstly with the causes of that event. So the 1905 revolution happens for a series of reasons. Firstly, and this is what this image is relating to here, in the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, it was a complete disaster. So the Russians, who are a massive force at this time, fighting the Japanese, who at this point are a very small, one single country, they lose terribly. The Japanese sink the entire Baltic fleet, and as a result of their disasters during the war, factories close, unemployment rises, and there's a huge increase in the cost of living. So the Russo-Japanese War is a disaster politically, but also a socio-economic disaster. That makes people more angry. Secondly, you get this catalyst of an event. So in 1905, when Father Gapon leads a peaceful protest in St. Petersburg, rather than listening to those protesters, what Nicholas does is he sets his troops on them. And the Tsarist troops open fire on those protesters, and 200 people are killed. That event becomes known as Bloody Sunday, and really it inspires others to rise up and fight. Also, we need to remember at the same time, and we learnt this in the last video, industrialisation has begun. And because industrialisation has begun, in particular in the cities, urban migration has happened. Now, because there has been huge urban migration during this period, there are horrific living conditions. And then lastly, you have this idea really spreading at this time. And there are brand new political ideas spreading throughout the country. And those new ideas really are Marxist ideas. And Marxist ideas rejuvenate the opposition movement. The opposition movement, which has been crushed under Alexander III, really starts up afresh in this period. So you've got this kind of perfect storm happening in 1905. The Russo-Japanese War reveals the problems of the Russian state. Bloody Sunday is a catalyst and shows that the Tsar doesn't care. But you've also underneath that got these horrific conditions due to industrialisation and finally new ideas spurring these people on. That leads us to the 1905 revolution. Let's look at what happened during that year. Now, the best way to understand the 1905 revolution is a series of little events. This is not one coordinated revolution. It's unlike that. Actually, what it is a series of sporadic, smaller, resistant movements, but some that are really significant. We've already talked about Bloody Sunday, and that's arguably the start of this year, but there are lots of events that happen. In February of 1905, there are assassinations, and even Nicholas's uncle was assassinated, a significant figure. In June of that year, the Potemkin, which is a battleship at this time, you can see a still from the film about the battleship Potemkin, the sailors mutiny. So you have mutinies in the army. You also have peasant revolts happening, and major peasant revolts happen in Poland and in Georgia at this time. And there are huge strikes in the towns. So the proletariat rises for the first time in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. And in September, a general strike is called, where pretty much everybody was asked to go out on strike. And significantly in St. Petersburg, the revolutionaries form themselves into councils of workers. And the name we call that is Soviets. And the Soviets are going to become really important when we get to the story of 1917. So what you can already see from this screen here is 1905 revolution is a series of different events, but really they are lots of different classes of people, all who are angry and all who are rising up. You've got workers, you've got peasants, you've got intelligentsia, you've got proper revolutionaries. This is a significant problem for Nicholas. But Nicholas does remarkably regain control, and he does it really through both a carrot and stick method. He appeases the people and then he uses a stick to beat them down. In terms of the carrot, the main two pieces of legislation he puts in right at the end of 1905 do control most people. He pushes through something called the October Manifesto. And in the October Manifesto, Nicholas promises a State Duma. He promises democracy. So the All Zemstvo, which he'd already ignored, he now changes his mind and says, actually, we need to introduce this. And at the same time, he promises civil liberties to the people. That is a good thing. Then in November, he also gives a carrot to the peasants. And in the November Manifesto, he promises to halve redemption payments that are remaining in 1906 and get rid of them entirely within a year. Those two things are significant, and they arguably appease most people. But he also uses a stick to control the rest of the people. And he brutally crushes any resistance that remains. So the army and the group called the Black Hundreds, who are very right-wing nationalist group, between October and April of the next year, as many as 15,000 people are executed by these groups. So Nicholas does regain control in a way that really wouldn't surprise you that Alexander III probably would have done something very similar. So let's see if we can sum up in this first period what we think about Nicholas. Nicholas was a ruler who arguably never wanted to rule, and he makes a series of silly mistakes in this period. Those silly mistakes anger the people and lead up to the 1905 revolution. And it's really just through the skin of his teeth and luck that he manages to regain control at the end of 1905 and stop this turning into something bigger. Whether Nicholas fulfills his promises is where we will lead in the next video, looking at the next 10 years of Nicholas's rule.